This isn't some story I heard from a friend of a friend. This happened to me. Every detail is burned into my memory, a constant reminder that sometimes the deepest wounds are inflicted with a polite smile and a porcelain teacup. The rejection came on a Tuesday, delivered in a sun-drenched living room that smelled of lemon polish and old money. I was sitting on a silk-upholstered armchair in Richard and Cynthia Sterling's immaculate Charleston home, my hands clasped around a cup of Earl Grey I hadn't touched. The object of my obsession, the reason I was there, was a massive, leather-bound charter sitting on the mahogany coffee table between us. The sacred text of the Sycamore Landing Homeowners Association. Cynthia's manicured finger, adorned with a diamond the size of a robin's egg, tapped its gilded cover as she delivered the verdict with a chillingly sweet smile. "We're so sorry, Elara," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescending pity reserved for stray animals. "But the board has decided to exercise Clause 7B of the Charter. The sale has been vetoed." My own real estate agent, a man named Henderson who had been practically giddy an hour before, looked like he'd been punched in the gut. But it was Richard's words, spoken as he stared out the bay window at the house I was supposed to buy, that truly broke me. "This street," he said, not even bothering to look at me, "is for a certain kind of person. It's about preserving a standard, a legacy. Perhaps something more appropriate for your background is available across the Cooper River. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. The silence in the car on the way back to my rented apartment in downtown Charleston was heavier than the humid summer air. Henderson kept clearing his throat, muttering about discrimination lawsuits and filing complaints, but we both knew it was useless. Sycamore Landing wasn't just a street, it was a fortress, and the Sterlings were the king and queen standing on the ramparts. Their HOA charter had been crafted by generations of lawyers to be a weaponized document of exclusion, wrapped in the palatable language of community preservation and architectural integrity. Clause 7B, the one Cynthia had quoted with such relish, was a masterpiece of legal ambiguity. It allowed the board, which consisted of Richard, Cynthia, and two of their closest friends, to veto any property sale based on a buyer's perceived inability to harmonize with the established character and social fabric of the community. It was a polite, legally defensible way of saying, no new money, no one who doesn't look and sound just like us. And I was the textbook definition of what they feared. I didn't come from a family with a name that appeared on plaques at the Gibbies Museum of Art or had a dedicated pew at St. Michael's Church. My name was Vance. My mother, Maria Vance, had cleaned houses for a living. Specifically, she had cleaned a house on Sycamore Landing, number 12, the grand Georgian-style home 2 doors down from the Sterlings. For 10 years, I had spent my afternoons after school sitting on the curb across the street, waiting for her to finish, doing my homework on the warm pavement. I watched the children of Sycamore Landing ride their shiny new bikes, attended by nannies. I watched the ladies drive off in their polished Mercedes for afternoon tennis at the country club. I watched the gas lights flicker on at dusk, turning the cobblestone street into something out of a fairy tale. That street wasn't just a collection of houses to me. It was the physical manifestation of the invisible wall that separated my world from theirs. My mother, tired and smelling of bleach, would come out at 6 o'clock, and we'd take the bus back to our tiny 2-bedroom apartment where the paint was always peeling and the air conditioning was always broken. She never showed any bitterness. She'd just look back at the grand houses and say, "One day, Laurie, you'll study hard, you'll make something of yourself, and you'll build your own beautiful world. You won't have to clean theirs." She died of cancer a month after I sold my first piece of software for a figure that still made my head spin. And with that money, I had one goal. It wasn't about showing off. It was a pilgrimage. I wanted to buy a house on that street, not to join their world, but to prove to my mother's memory that her sacrifice had meant something, that her daughter had finally built that beautiful world she'd promised. I set my sights on number 14, a stunning white brick colonial with black shutters and a garden full of azaleas right next door to the house my mom used to clean. It was for sale by an elderly couple, the Abernathys, who were moving to Florida. My offer was all cash, 20% over asking. It was so high they couldn't possibly refuse. They accepted it without a second thought. I was ecstatic. I thought the hard part was over. I had no idea about the HOA. I had no idea about the interview. I thought it was a formality, a chance to meet the neighbors. I walked into the Sterling's house that day as a prospective homeowner. I walked out as the girl from the wrong side of the tracks, just like my mother before me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Richard Sterling's words echoed in my head. Appropriate for your background. It was a slap in the face, not just to me, but to my mother's memory. They hadn't just denied me a house. They had declared that everything I had ever achieved was worthless because I didn't have the right last name. I sat at my laptop, fueled by a potent cocktail of grief and fury, and I started digging. My entire career was built on finding patterns in data, on seeing the connections that others missed. I applied that same obsessive focus to Sycamore Landing. I pulled property records, tax assessments, and sales histories for every house on that cul-de-sac going back 50 years. I cross-referenced names with social registries, country club memberships, and charity boards. A picture began to emerge. The Sterlings weren't just residents, they were curators. In the last decade, 5 families had sold their homes. Each one was replaced by a family that was a carbon copy of the Sterlings. Old Charleston money, children in the right private schools, surnames that were etched into the city's history. I then looked at the families who had left. 2 of them had been forced out by financial hardship after being buried under an avalanche of HOA fines for ridiculous infractions. Improper shade of beige for their window trim, non-native flora in their garden beds, unapproved mailbox font. It was a slow, methodical financial strangulation. The Sterlings would bleed them dry until they had no choice but to sell, and then a buyer, conveniently a friend of the Sterlings, would swoop in. This wasn't a community, it was a kingdom, and they were purging anyone who didn't bend the knee. The anger in my chest began to cool, hardening into something else, something cold and sharp. They thought they had swatted me away like a fly. They thought I'd just crawl back to whatever side of the river they thought I belonged on. They had no idea who they were dealing with. My mother taught me how to clean up messes. The Sterlings and their perfect little kingdom were the biggest mess I had ever seen, and I was about to start cleaning. My first move was to liquidate. I sold nearly a third of my portfolio in the tech company I'd co-founded. It was a painful decision. That company was my baby, the product of a decade of sleepless nights and relentless work. But revenge requires capital, and I was going to need a war chest. The market was good to me, and within a week, I had just over $18 million sitting in a business account, ready to be deployed. The second move was to become invisible. Elara Vance, the tech prodigy, the new money girl who dared to knock on Sycamore Landing's door, had to disappear. I hired a team of lawyers in Wilmington, Delaware, a city known for its corporate-friendly privacy laws. They established a parent company for me, a faceless entity called the Artemis Group. Underneath Artemis, we created a web of anonymous LLCs, each with a bland, forgettable name: Low Country Holdings, Palmetto Investments, Charleston Heritage Properties. Each LLC was registered to a different P.O. box, managed by a different paralegal. On paper, they had no connection to each other and absolutely no connection to me. I was a ghost in my own machine. For the next 6 months, I did nothing in Charleston. I let the sting of my public humiliation fade. I let the Sterlings believe they had won, that I had slunk away with my tail between my legs. Instead, I turned my attention to the burgeoning tech and real estate markets in Austin and Raleigh. Using the predictive analytics software I had designed, my anonymous LLCs began acquiring undervalued commercial properties and small apartment buildings. My algorithm was brilliant at identifying neighborhoods on the cusp of gentrification, pinpointing properties that were underpriced but sat in the path of inevitable development. I was ruthless. I bought, held for a few months as the market surged, and sold for profits that made my accountants weep with joy. The 18 million grew to 25, then 30. I lived like a monk, pouring every dollar of profit back into the Artemis Group. While the Sterlings were hosting garden parties and congratulating themselves on preserving their precious legacy, I was building an empire in the shadows, one brick and one line of code at a time. My target, Sycamore Landing, was a short, dead-end street with only 10 houses, a perfect, self-contained ecosystem. The Sterlings lived in the grandest one at the very end of the cul-de-sac, number 20. My dream house, number 14, was still owned by the Abernethys, my initial deal having collapsed under the HOA's veto. The other 8 houses were my chessboard. I spent weeks building a complete dossier on the owner of every single home. I wasn't just looking at their finances, I was looking at their lives. Who had kids in college and tuition bills piling up? Who was recently retired and complaining about property taxes? Who was sick of Cynthia Sterling's weekly memos about lawn maintenance? I was looking for the cracks in the fortress wall. The first crack was named Miller. The Millers, at number 4, were a couple in their late 60s. He was a retired professor, she was an artist, their children and grandchildren lived in Oregon, and I found through a deep dive into their social media that they were desperately homesick for family. They were also being crushed by the Sterlings. I obtained copies of the HOA violation notices they'd received, a $500 fine because their granddaughter had left a tricycle on the driveway overnight, a $1,000 fine for a wind chime Cynthia deemed inaudible but visually discordant. They were proud people, but they were trapped. Their house was their nest egg, but the local market was slow, and no one wanted to buy into a neighborhood with such a notoriously tyrannical HOA. This was my opening. Through Low Country Holdings, I made my first move. I hired a Charleston real estate agent who had no connection to Henderson, my previous agent. This new agent, a hungry young guy named Ben, knew only that he represented a quiet investment firm from out of state. I instructed him to make the Millers an offer they couldn't possibly refuse. All cash, 30% above market value. But I added a personal touch. The offer included a clause that was unheard of, a fully paid, white-glove relocation package to anywhere in the continental United States. We would pack their belongings, ship their car, and handle the purchase of their new home in Portland. We were not just buying their house, we were buying them their freedom. The Millers, understandably, were skeptical. Ben told me they asked a dozen times who this mysterious buyer was. He stuck to the script I'd given him. A Delaware-based firm looking for stable, long-term real estate investments in historic neighborhoods. It was vague, but plausible. The money was real, and that's all that mattered. They accepted the offer within 24 hours. The news of the sale sent a tremor through Sycamore Landing. Richard and Cynthia Sterling were, by all accounts, furious. They couldn't veto the sale because my LLC was, on paper, a perfect corporate citizen with immaculate financials. There was no character to assess. They tried to argue that a corporate-owned home would violate the single-family residential nature of the street, but my lawyers were ready. The LLC's charter clearly stated its purpose was to hold the property as a residential asset, not to operate a business out of it. They had no legal footing. The sale went through. I now owned 1/10 of Sycamore Landing. The house sat empty. I instructed a local property manager to maintain the lawn and garden to a standard even higher than Cynthia Sterling's. The house was to be kept pristine, a silent, perfectly manicured monument to my first small victory. The Sterlings had no idea that the war had already begun, and they had just lost the first piece of territory. They thought it was an anomaly. I knew it was a blueprint. I had found the crack in the wall, and I was about to shatter it, one house at a time. The Millers were out, happy in Oregon with their family, and I was just getting started, 1 down, 9 to go. The Sterling's response to the Miller sale was predictable. They doubled down on their tyranny. A memo was circulated. I had a copy within an hour, thanks to a disgruntled resident who had started to see the Sterlings for what they were, reminding everyone on Sycamore Landing of the HOA's commitment to aesthetic unity. It was a thinly veiled threat. They began patrolling the street like guards, clipboards in hand, looking for any infraction, no matter how small. They were trying to terrorize the remaining residents into compliance to ensure no one else got the idea to sell to an outsider. It was exactly what I had hoped they would do. They were helping me alienate their own allies. My next target was the Carson family at number 8. They were younger, in their 40s, with 2 teenage sons. Mr. Carson had been a high-flying executive at a shipping company, but I discovered through financial records that the company had recently downsized and he had been quietly forced into early retirement. They were leveraged to the hilt, trying to maintain the Sycamore Landing lifestyle on a fraction of their previous income. Their son's private school tuition was crippling them. They were the definition of house rich and cash poor. The Sterlings, who saw financial struggle as a moral failing, began to target them relentlessly. The Carsons were fined $2,000 because a patch of their lawn was showing signs of brown spot fungus. They were cited for a basketball hoop in their driveway that was, according to the charter, an apparatus of common recreation not in keeping with the street's historic character. I saw my opening. This time, I used a different LLC, Palmetto Investments, and a different real estate agent, a seasoned veteran from a rival firm to Bend. The strategy had to be different, too. The Carsons were proud. They wouldn't want a handout. The offer had to be framed as a savvy financial decision for them. My agent approached them with a proposition, a discreet, off-market sale. No sign in the yard, no open houses, no nosy neighbors. The price was again significantly above market value, enough to clear their mortgage, pay off their debts, and set them up comfortably somewhere new. The most appealing part of the offer, however, was the timing. We could close in 10 days, and the pressure would be gone. The shame of their financial struggle, the constant harassment from the Sterlings, it would all just vanish. Mrs. Carson called my agent in tears the day they accepted. She said they felt like they could finally breathe again. When the sold sign went up, I insisted on it this time, just for a day, as a message. Cynthia Sterling reportedly stood on her porch and stared at it for a full 10 minutes without moving. 2 houses now belonged to me. 2 pristine, empty homes on her perfect street. The rumors began to fly. Who was this faceless corporation buying up Sycamore Landing? Richard Sterling, with all his real estate connections, tried to find out. He called brokers all over Charleston. He had his lawyers try to pierce the corporate veil of my LLCs. But the walls I had built in Delaware were impenetrable. All he found were more P.O. boxes and paralegals paid to say, "We do not disclose the identity of our clients." He was a king who couldn't see his enemy, and it was driving him mad. For the next 18 months, I continued my silent conquest. I was a phantom, buying up the street piece by piece. I bought number 18 from a widow whose children were begging her to move into an assisted living facility closer to them. My offer included paying for her first year at the facility of her choice. I bought number 2 from a couple going through a messy divorce, an all-cash offer that allowed them to quickly liquidate their main asset and go their separate ways was a godsend. Each purchase used a new LLC, a new agent, a new narrative tailored to the seller's specific needs. I learned that one family dreamed of sailing around the world, so my offer was structured to include the purchase of a brand new catamaran. I wasn't just offering money, I was offering a solution to their problems, an escape hatch from their lives, and, more importantly, from the Sterlings. With each sale, the Sterlings grew more desperate. They tried to amend the HOA charter to prohibit corporate ownership entirely, but it required a vote from the homeowners. By the time they called the meeting, I secretly controlled 4 of the 10 votes. My property manager, a quiet, unassuming man named David, attended the meeting as the proxy for my 4 LLCs. He sat silently while Richard Sterling gave a blustering speech about vulture capitalists and preserving the soul of their community. When the time came to vote, David calmly cast all 4 of his votes against the amendment. The motion failed. Cynthia Sterling looked at David as if he had personally set fire to her prize-winning roses. They knew they were losing control, but they couldn't understand how. They were fighting an enemy with no face, no name, and a seemingly bottomless bank account. The street began to feel eerie. Half the houses were now dark at night. Perfectly kept lawns, empty driveways. It was a beautiful, manicured ghost town. The remaining residents, the Sterling loyalists, grew paranoid. They would watch as David's landscaping crews came and went, as painters gave a fresh coat to the shutters on a house no one lived in. The sense of community the Sterlings fought so hard to preserve was dead, and they were the ones who had killed it. They had fostered an environment of fear and judgment, and when a better offer came along, people fled without a second thought. Their curated paradise was rotting from the inside out, and I was the disease. The 2-year mark since my rejection was approaching. I now owned 7 houses. Only 3 remained: the Sterling's mansion at number 20, the Abernathy's home at number 14, my dream house, and number 12, the house my mother used to clean, owned by the last of the Sterling allies, the Chatfields. The board was now me. The kingdom was mine. It was time to go for the checkmate. The first domino to fall in the endgame was the Chatfields. They were old guard Charleston, just like the Sterlings, and had been their staunchest allies. They had voted with them on every fine, every rejection, every petty rule. They believed in the mission of preserving Sycamore Landing's exclusivity, but they had one weakness: a son who had made a series of disastrous business investments, and they had co-signed his loans. I knew from my research they were on the hook for nearly $2 million, and the bank's patience was wearing thin. They were facing financial ruin and public disgrace, a fate worse than death in their social circle. They would never sell to one of my LLCs. Their pride wouldn't allow it, so I changed tactics. I had one of my lawyers approach their lawyer with a very different kind of offer. It wasn't an offer to buy their house. It was a private loan proposal. An anonymous benefactor through a trust was willing to provide them with the full $2 million at 0 interest to clear their son's debt. The collateral for the loan? Their house at number 12 Sycamore Landing. They would have 10 years to pay it back. It was a lifeline so generous it seemed too good to be true. They didn't know that the terms of the loan were written by my legal team with a series of brutal cascading default clauses. If they were late on a single payment, even by a day, the entire loan would become due immediately, and the house would be forfeit. Pride is a powerful motivator, but so is fear. Faced with the certainty of public humiliation, they took the deal. They signed the papers, the debt was cleared, and they felt an immense sense of relief. They believed some anonymous angel had saved them. They had no idea they had just handed me the keys to their prison. I now had them on a leash. The final piece of the puzzle was the Abernathys at number 14, my house. They had watched the street empty out, watched their friends and neighbors disappear one by one. Their idyllic retirement community had become a silent, lonely street. They were rattled. They had put the house back on the market, but the stories about the Ghost Corporation buying up Sycamore Landing had scared away most buyers. No one wanted to buy into a neighborhood owned by a mystery. This time, I didn't use an LLC. I didn't use a proxy. I called their real estate agent myself. "My name is Elara Vance," I said. "I made an offer on this house 2 years ago. I'd like to make another one." The agent was stunned. He remembered me. He remembered the humiliation at the Sterling's house. I made them the exact same offer I had made 2 years prior, not $1 more. The agent told me they were hesitant, worried about the HOA. "You can assure them," I said, my voice cold as ice, "that the HOA will no longer be a problem." They accepted within the hour. The closing was scheduled for the following Friday. The day before the closing, I made my move. As the majority property owner on Sycamore Landing, controlling 8 of the 10 properties, one through direct ownership via the Chatfields collateral, I called an emergency meeting of the Homeowners Association. The agenda was a single item, a vote to dissolve the HOA and nullify its charter. The meeting was held by law at the HOA president's house. I walked up the stone pathway to Richard and Cynthia Sterling's home for the first time in 2 years. This time, I didn't wait to be invited in. I let myself through the front door. They were in the living room, the same room where they had shattered my dreams. Richard, Cynthia, and a terrified-looking Mr. Chatfield were the only ones there. My property manager, David, stood silently by the door. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard blustered, his face turning a blotchy red. "Who do you think you, are?" I didn't answer him. I walked over to the mahogany coffee table and picked up the heavy leather-bound charter. I let its weight settle in my hands. "According to Clause 15C of this charter," I said, my voice calm and even, "a vote of a 2/3 majority of homeowners is required for dissolution. I am the legal proxy for the owners of numbers 2, 4, 8, 16, and 18. I also hold the deed and collateral for number 12. I looked at Mr. Chatfield, who visibly shrank. "And tomorrow, I will be the owner of number 14. That's 7 votes, 8, if you count the Chatfield's inevitable abstention." I let the book fall from my hands onto the floor with a heavy thud. "The vote is to dissolve, effective immediately." Cynthia stared at me, her face a mask of horrified disbelief. All the color had drained from it. "You?" she whispered, the single word filled with the venom that could curdle milk. "It was you all along." I gave her a small, tight smile. "You said this street was for a certain kind of person," I replied. "You were right. It's for me." I turned and walked out, leaving them in the ruins of their little kingdom. The next day, I signed the papers for my house. It was finally mine, but I wasn't done. The revenge wasn't complete until I had it all. The final act was yet to come. The dissolution of the HOA was like a dam breaking. The intricate web of rules and regulations that had governed life on Sycamore Landing for 50 years vanished overnight. The power the Sterlings held over their neighbors, the power to fine and foreclose and dictate every minute detail of their lives, was gone. And with it, the very foundation of their social standing crumbled. Their kingdom had no walls, no charter, no subjects. It was just a house on a street that I now almost entirely owned. I spent the first month living in my new home in a state of quiet bliss. I hired architects and designers not to tear the house down, but to restore it to its original colonial glory with a few modern touches. I walked through the empty rooms, imagining a future that was once an impossible dream. I sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the sky, the same porch I had stared at as a child sitting on the opposite curb. The street was still silent, my other 7 houses kept in pristine, empty condition by my property managers. It was a strange, peaceful purgatory. But while I was building my new life, the Sterlings were watching theirs fall apart. The value of their property was intrinsically tied to the prestige and exclusivity of Sycamore Landing. With the HOA gone, and the street now majority owned by a single, mysterious entity, that prestige evaporated. They were no longer the rulers of Charleston's most exclusive address. They were residents of a ghost town. When their property tax assessment came in, the value had plummeted by 40%. The legacy they had fought so hard to protect had become a financial anchor dragging them down. Furthermore, I now controlled the street's private service contracts, the exclusive landscaping company that created the award-winning gardens, the private security firm that patrolled the cul-de-sac, the sanitation service that made twice-weekly backdoor pickups so no one had to see a garbage can on the curb. They were all group contracts, negotiated and paid for through the HOA. Now, the HOA was gone. I sent a polite, formal letter to the Sterlings and the Chatfields, informing them that the Artemis Group would not be renewing the street-wide service agreements. They were, of course, free to negotiate their own private contracts. I knew, having seen the astronomical quotes for single-home services, that it would cost them a fortune to maintain the lifestyle they were accustomed to. The Chatfields broke first. A month after receiving my letter and staring down the barrel of a 5-figure annual bill for landscaping alone, their lawyer called mine. They wanted out. They couldn't afford the house. They couldn't afford the loan payments. They couldn't afford to live on a street that had become a public monument to their humiliation. I had my LLC, Charleston Heritage Properties, make them an offer. It was a lowball, just enough to let them walk away with a shred of dignity and enough cash to disappear somewhere up north. They took it without hesitation. I now owned number 12, the house my mother had spent a decade cleaning on her hands and knees. The victory was so profound, so deeply personal, it felt sacred. That left only the Sterlings. They were isolated, trapped in their mansion at the end of my street. Their allies were gone. Their power was a memory. Their wealth was draining away as they tried to privately fund the services an entire community once shared. They were living on an island of their own making, and the tide was rising. 2 years to the day after they had rejected me in their sun-drenched living room, I walked up their stone pathway one last time. I didn't knock. The door was unlocked, and I let myself in. They were sitting in that same room, but the atmosphere was different. The air was stale. The lemon polish smell was gone. A thin layer of dust coated the mahogany table. They looked older, smaller. "Elara," Richard said, his voice a hoarse whisper. There was no fight left in him. "Richard, Cynthia," I said, keeping my tone level and devoid of emotion. "I've come to make you an offer on your house." Cynthia let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "We're not selling, not to you." "Oh, I think you will," I said softly. I placed a folder on the coffee table. "That's a cash offer. It's well below what you think your house is worth, of course. It's probably just enough to buy a nice condo somewhere, maybe over the river." I let the words hang in the air, a perfect echo of the insult they had thrown at me. Richard opened the folder, his hands trembling slightly. He saw the number and his face went pale. It was an insult, a slap. "This is ridiculous, he stammered. "Is it?" I asked. "Who else is going to buy it? What discerning family wants to live in a house surrounded on all sides by empty properties owned by a single corporation? Who wants to live at the end of a dead-end street with no security, no community, and a property value in freefall? This isn't a seller's market, Richard. In fact, you have a market of exactly one buyer, me. That is the only offer you will ever get." I looked from his face to Cynthia's. I saw the flicker of panic in her eyes, the slow, dawning horror of utter and complete defeat. They had spent their lives building walls to keep people like me out. They never imagined that someone like me would have the patience, the resources, and the will to simply buy the walls, the ground they were built on, and everything inside. "You have 24 hours to accept," I said, turning to leave. "After that, the offer goes down by 10% every day. I have time." I didn't look back as I walked out their door, closing it gently behind me. I knew they would take it. Their pride was a luxury they could no longer afford. The street was finally, completely mine. It's been a year since the Sterlings packed up their antiques and vanished from Charleston society. I never learned where they went, and I never cared to find out. Their house, like all the others, is undergoing a quiet, respectful renovation. The street is no longer called Sycamore Landing. Its name has been legally changed. It's now called the Maria Vance Foundation, named for my mother. The 10 beautiful houses on this street will never be for sale again. They have a new purpose. In a few months, when the work is complete, they will become homes, not for the wealthy, not for the privileged, not for those with the right last name, but for single mothers who are fighting to build a better life for their children. It will be a sanctuary, a place of subsidized housing where women like my mother can live in a safe, beautiful environment while they get back on their feet, go to school, or start a business. It will be a community built not on exclusion and judgment, but on support and second chances. I live at number 14, in the heart of it all, my home. From my porch, I can see number 12, where my mother used to work, and I can see the former Sterling mansion at the end of the cul-de-sac. Sometimes late at night, when the street is quiet, and the only sound is the wind rustling through the ancient oak trees, I think about what I've done. I didn't just buy a street. I erased a legacy of arrogance and replaced it with a legacy of hope. The Sterlings wanted to preserve a standard, to curate a perfect, unchanging monument to their own importance. And in a way, I suppose I gave them what they wanted. They wanted a neighborhood of ghosts from the past, so I bought them a graveyard. The end.